Well, let's do a little update on Russia and Ukraine, and I think you'll see at the end of this how this might play into Bible prophecy because it has an impact on the Middle East. So this is Russia-Ukraine midweek update number 2. Just a reminder, here are some of the different channels and outlets that we're on. We've also just added Brighteon channel. I'll try to get a link for that, and on Sunday we'll include that in the description on YouTube so you can go to these different places. And we're still working on a podcast, but we haven't made much progress this week just because of other obligations. So we talk about the convergence of events, that things seem to be happening much more rapidly. And again, this is the grid that I look at things through, this is kind of how I process things, that there's a ACLU, the prophetic ACLU, acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. Meaning that things are going to happen more quickly as we get closer to the Lord's return. There's going to be a convergence of events. All of these different lines of Bible prophecy that are talked about, Matthew 24 and Revelation, they're going to be converging and happening all at the same time in many cases. There's also a logistics aspect. Then before there are wars, people have to make preparations for war, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then understanding that as we get closer to the time, we'll have better understanding. Some weeks when I look at things, this is a picture of a street in Lebanon, and this is the power grid. They've had a lot of power problems there, and you can understand why. You can see the electrical junction boxes, and you can see this mass of wires. It's easy to understand why they might have electrical grid problems when the grid at the end point looks like this as it's going to homes. But sometimes this is what it looks like to me when I sit down and look at the news and events and try to look at them in the light of Scripture. Sometimes this is the way the week starts. And sometimes it takes me all the way till Sunday to kind of untangle this mess and make a little bit of sense of it. So I haven't talked a lot about Russia-Ukraine, although it's been in the news, so we'll kind of do an overview and summary. But we understand that this is one of the things that the Bible says is going to happen, that the words of prophecy, at least from Daniel's perspective, are sealed up till the time of the end. The question is, are we at the end? If we're at the end, then these prophetic scriptures, they're actually going to unfold in a real world that exists at that time. And it says that those many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. And I think you can see in our world that the wicked really don't have a good understanding of what's going on. I mean, I do feel a lot of times like I'm living in a parallel universe to a lot of others. But then Daniel chapter 12, and it also says this elsewhere in Daniel 11, but the wise shall understand. It says the wise shall understand and instruct many. So as we get closer to these things, our vision will get clear and we'll be able to see things more directly. So let's talk about Ukraine. So this is a long-standing issue. There was a war in Ukraine back in 2014 when Russia came in and took over the. There was a war back in 2014 when Russia came in and took over the Crimean Peninsula that you see here in the south. There are, as you'll see as we go through this, there are a number of different regions. This is the Donetsk and Luhansk region. Those are heavily ethnic Russian. On the Crimean Peninsula, also, they had a heavily ethnic Russian population. So in 2014, Putin took over Crimea. There have been some reports that Russia exercises effective control over these regions in the east part of Ukraine. You can see here, these red circles are Russian troops that have been gathered along the border. Russia has its major seaport at Sevastopol here in Crimea. But Ukraine also has a seaport up in this region, but they have to get through this strait, and there's a bridge here, and Russia really controls that bridge now. So it's a very complicated situation. Ukraine is a very unique country. It has a lot of resources, minerals, some coal, but it also has about 25% of the world's high-grade topsoil. I mean, 25% of the whole world. So it is really a breadbasket. And so any war that would occur in this region would affect farming and that type of thing. So that would have another impact on the supply chain issues that we're going. If you want to read some reports on this, Institute for Study of War at understandingwar.org has some longstanding reports about, what are Putin's military operations? Why is he doing this? What's going on? Some newspapers, this is from the Times of London, say that this comes about because of Putin's paranoia, that he doesn't know what to do, that he just doesn't understand Ukraine, or that he's making Ukraine into a bigger issue that he does not need to make it into. But he has made it into this. A couple weeks ago, there was this report. This also was in the Times of London on Friday, January 28th, so 2 weeks ago today. Putin was 2 weeks from an all-out invasion. At that time, they said he had about 70% of the troops that he needed to invade Ukraine. There's also talks that he was going to do these cyber attacks. There's been talk about sanctions and where's Russia's money and where is Russia vulnerable. So there was a call. This is a report from almost 2 weeks ago that Putin had an hour-long call with Emmanuel Macron. There are concerns that any attack or war would have a big impact on particularly the natural gas that Europe relies on for heat in the winter. They're concerned that would go away. There have been, with Western nations like the United States, that have withdrawn their staff from Kiev, and I think there was a report issued just yesterday or today from the U.S. that said that if you're American in Ukraine, you need to get out. Now, does this mean that war is imminent? We've been on the verge of this now for a month. The U.S. has sent some troops into Poland, here in Poland, but then Biden has also come out and said, hey, we're not going to send our troops into Russia. So it doesn't appear that the United States wants to commit troops. And so Putin is using this as leverage to negotiate whatever deal that he wants. I mean, there's some things that he's concerned about, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. There are these predictions that the war will be a bloody war. Russia has done a couple things that, unless you're really going to do an attack, you might not do. So Putin has moved blood plasma supplies into the areas near Ukraine. There were also pictures released yesterday of a field hospital. You can see it there in the red circle, that was constructed in areas near the Ukraine border. And so why are you building a field hospital if you're not going to do this? You can see the similarity between this satellite photo and then this picture, which is a field hospital that was constructed in another region where Russia had some troops at the time. So then the question becomes, if you're not going to do an attack, why do you need the field hospitals? The one thing, too, that you'll find in all of this is that there's been this rather incredible propaganda war that's been going on both sides. Last week, the United States come out last Sunday and said that, boy, there's just going to be a horrible toll that will happen. 50,000 dead Ukrainians, 4,000 dead Russians. Russia back immediately said there's no way that that's true. So the question is, why is Ukraine so important to all of this? And it appears that from the research that I've done is that part of the component is a religious component, a spiritual component as to why Putin is interested in Ukraine. Putin wants to promote the Russian Orthodox Church, which is considered to be the most important branch of the Orthodox Church, the supreme branch of the Orthodox Church. Now, Ukraine has its own. In fact, this is an article from this morning's Washington Post talking about how, people in Ukraine also see this as a religious aspect. Report from a couple weeks ago, January 22nd, people are ready to tear apart Russians with their bare hands. That was speaking from the perspective of the Ukrainians. And in along the Black Sea, sort of in this region of Russia, a little bit south of there, Putin has what has been estimated to be his personal villa residence that's cost about $1 billion. Now, I've reported on this before. This is a Russian icon, the Lady of Kazan. The Lady of Kazan is an icon of the Russian Orthodox Church. The original has been lost. The picture is covered over with these jewels and silver and gold overlay. But there were reports, and this was in the Investor's Business Daily back in 2014, before Putin went into Ukraine and took over Crimea, that this icon had been removed from its location and flown around the Crimean Peninsula, because the tradition in Russia was that this icon would lead the Russians into battle. When the Russians went to fight Napoleon at Waterloo, this icon was taken in at the head of the troops in that battle. So it's a very important icon to Russia. Here is a meeting in the upper left-hand corner is a meeting that Putin had with Pope John Paul II back in 2003. This was when Pope John Paul II had become very infirm and really could not get around or travel anymore. And they had the meeting, and there you see at the meeting is this icon, the Lady of Kazan. The goal of John Paul II was that he was going to take this icon to Russia and somehow heal the rift between Roman Catholicism and the Russian Orthodox Church, but he never got to do that. He got ill. But here at this meeting, this icon was central. In fact, a couple meetings that they had, this was a very important thing. And Pope John Paul II considered this one of his favorite icons of Mary and kept it in his private chapel for a number of years at the Vatican and prayed to it every day. So it was very important. It was returned to Russia. This is Pope John Paul II giving it to Cardinal McCarrick, who returned it to Russia in 2004. So there's a sort of this underlying spiritual aspect to what's going on and the rift between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, I don't see any evidence that Putin is a religious man and that he would probably use the Russian Orthodox Church as support for his position. I don't think he's religious, but he recognizes the importance of this to Russians. There were some drills recently in Belarus, some drills just yesterday, and you can see that here's a map. Belarus is this country right here to the north of Ukraine. Kiev is located somewhere in sort of what I would call north-central Ukraine. The quickest route of invasion, by the way, would be straight down from here, but the problem is that the Chernobyl radioactive exclusion zone sits between the easiest route from Belarus to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. So there's all kinds of reports. This has just been going on for a week, and a Russian envoy said, and you'll see a little bit about this in a moment, that the West is pushing us to embrace China. That's why we're getting together with China, because you guys won't listen to us and you won't give us what you want. You can see here too that Russia has this little enclave on the Adriatic Sea between Lithuania and Poland. They are very concerned, though. They want to maintain the Black Sea port, and they want more access for their navy to water. They don't have a warm seaport. The other thing that's important is that there is issues with Europeans' gas supply. They get about, I think above 50% of their gas from Russia. Russia has some of the largest gas reserves on the planet. To give you an example of this, we talked a little bit about the Leviathan field in the Eastern Mediterranean that Israel has discovered. That gas field has recoverable reserves, it's estimated, you never know until you actually extract everything from it, of about 22 trillion cubic feet of gas. That is far, far from the largest. That is not anywhere close to the largest gas field on the planet. The largest known gas field on the planet is the South Pars gas field between Qatar and Iran. It's a shared gas field. That gas field has estimated recoverable reserves of 35,000 trillion cubic feet as opposed to 22 trillion. So 35,000 trillion cubic feet as opposed to 22 trillion. In the top 10 known gas fields in the world between Russia and Iran, I think 6 of them are located in Russia and Iran, including the South Pars field. A couple are located over in the Stan republics, and then there's one in the United States. So there's been this push on, can we get some kind of alternative gas for Europe? Now, about a third of Russian gas transits the pipelines that you see there crossing Ukraine. There's also been a Turk Stream to bring gas from across Turkey and the Black Sea, but there's also been this Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is not really online yet. It's still awaiting German approval. But this has been a big issue because Germany is heavily dependent on Russian gas. And you can see the other pipeline that comes across Belarus and Poland to Germany. And Russia can just cut off the gas, and Germany would have major heat problems. The alternative answer right now, and I talked last week about the East Med pipeline, and I might have some more comments on that Sunday, but that would be an alternative, but that's years away from coming online. And so the only alternative right now is getting liquefied natural gas by tanker to Europe. It's hard to shift the supply that quickly. So this is an issue. In fact, this was a big article in the Financial Times a couple weeks ago about the fact that Germany has a huge Russian problem because they can't really support NATO because they are reliant on Russian gas. So one of the goals in all of this appears to have been that Putin wanted to divide NATO. He wanted to get NATO arguing among themselves. And if that was one of his goals, he's certainly done that because Germany has been very reluctant to sign on to what's going on. Another thing that Russia has done is they have introduced legislation in the Russian Duma, their parliament, to declare 2 regions of Ukraine. And the ones that it appears that Putin is most interested in are the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions. Those regions are located here in this area, those are the Russian separatist-controlled regions, and so Russia could declare those. The Russian parliament could say, "Hey, these are part of Russia," and we can go into them because they invited us in, and we're not really invading anything. But that also carries some risk with it to Russia that they that also carries some risk to it because Russia just can't take over those regions, because then it would have an impact on other things that Russia is trying to do in these different regions. So this is the Donetsk and Luhansk region, and here is the most natural route to Kiev would be through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where they had the meltdown 40 years ago or so of this plant, and it's still too radioactive. So here is a small map that shows that Russia is just, they're concerned about Ukraine, or about the NATO picking up Ukraine as a member of NATO, because they consider that to be a threat to their borders. Now, Russia's the largest country, landmass on Earth, but they're very concerned about their western flank. So this is a lot of what it's about, and Putin trying to exclude his. Putin trying to expand his influence in different areas. And so that's what's happened here. So this is an article, again, from the Financial Times about on January 22nd, about the demand for a new global order. And at that time, Putin and Xi from China had a online meeting. And just listen to what the Financial Times said back on January 22nd. The Western alliance has threatened the Kremlin with massive and unprecedented sanctions if Russia attacks Ukraine. But as the Ukraine crisis reaches boiling point, Western efforts to isolate and punish Russia are likely to be undermined by the support of China, Russia's giant neighbor. When Putin travels to Beijing for the beginning of the Winter Olympics on February 4, the Russian president will meet the leader who has become his most important ally, Xi Jinping of China. In a phone call between Putin and Xi in December, and you can see that in the photograph, the Chinese leader supported Russia's demand that Ukraine must never join NATO. A decade ago, such a relationship seemed unlikely. China and Russia were as much rivals as partners. But after a period when both countries have sparred persistently with the U.S., Xi's support for Putin reflects a growing identity between the interests and worldviews of Moscow and Beijing. According to Chinese media, Xi told Putin that certain international forces are arbitrarily interfering in the internet affairs of China and Russia under the guise of democracy and human rights. So on January 4th in Beijing, this is from a Russian newspaper, showing that Xi and Putin actually had a meeting. They got together and talked. They aired their grievances, and one of the things that came out of that meeting was they said, we are going to end this influence of the West. They're attacking our democracy. This happened just before the Olympics opened on on February 4th. Putin attended the ceremony. So they had their first in-person meeting in a couple of years. Part of this was that they signed some agreements. They issued a joint statement. They also entered into a energy deal where to boost the gas supply from Russia to China, because China doesn't have a lot of resources. So they've entered into this agreement to try to defeat Western sanctions. I think there's also an agreement. Part of this gas agreement was that they're going to do that, and it's not going to be denominated in dollars. They're trying to get rid of the U.S. petrodollar. How successful they'll be in that, I don't know. That's a pretty ambitious goal, but I think maybe eventually at some time it will happen. I don't know if this is the time or not. Again, there's a concept, this is from the Times of London just this morning, that there's this information war going on. The other interesting thing, though, is how does this impact the Middle East? Last week, the Wall Street Journal, 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, had this editorial: why Russia and China build up Iran. So the other thing that's coming out of this that I think relates to Bible prophecy is this support of China and Russia for Iran. And we know that Iran, Persia, is an enemy of Israel. They talk about it all the time. We have the Vienna talks going on to try to remake the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, to limit what Iran can do. As they're doing these negotiations, though, the United States releases some of the sanctions waivers. In other words, they say we're not going to put sanctions on the civilian nuclear program of Iran. And as a result of that, there's about $29 billion in money that's going to be released to Iran. And Iran's not giving up anything at all. And so this is not the way to negotiate. But this is a unilateral thing. The U.S. negotiating team led by Robert Malley. I'll talk a little bit more about him on Sunday. He's just a completely he's issued statements in favor of Hamas, even Hezbollah. Talk a little bit more in detail about it. Caroline Glick had an excellent interview yesterday at Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney. If you want to get a little bit of a better understanding about this has been Malley's modus operandi. But so here, Russia and China are not only making an alliance, but they're also building up Iran. So this is just a little bit from the Wall Street Journal editorial a couple weeks ago. Though vulnerable, Tehran is the ideal Middle East partner in an alliance to destroy the U.S.-led order. The Ukraine crisis exposes a flaw in President Biden's Iran strategy. Washington engages with Beijing and Moscow as if they share core U.S. interests with respect to Iran, when instead they are working with Tehran to undermine the American-led global order. That's certainly what officials in Tehran are saying. Last Wednesday, a spokesman for the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee said this: in the New World Order, a triangle consisting of three powers, Iran, Russia, and China, has formed. And he was clear about the goal, and this is the goal: that this new arrangement heralds the end of the inequitable hegemony of the United States in the West. There's also been developments about China really pushing its Belt and Road Initiative and the importance that Iraq has in China's development. In fact, it may be the most important part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And that would also be significant prophetically, I believe. So this is where we are. This article also said this: Putin may agree that Iran should never possess nuclear weapons. Cooperating closely with the U.S. to achieve that goal, however, interferes with his more urgent priority, which is to undermine the American-led order. For his part, Chinese President Xi Jinping makes a similar set of calculations. Thanks to one of history's most rapid military buildups, China now has Asia's largest air force, the world's largest army by number of active duty troops, and largest navy by number of vessels. So this is what's going on. This push for a global order. So again, China and Russia had this meeting. Putin went to Beijing and met with Putin. Putin went to Beijing and met with Xi. And again, coming out of that meeting, they had an agreement, a joint statement. Now, the statement never mentions Ukraine, but it does have a few statements. This thing is about 6,000 words long. Joint statement of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on the international relations entering a new era in global sustainable development. So you can see they got to touch all the bases to assuage the concerns of the Green New Deal type people. But here's just a couple excerpts from that joint statement. The sides oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on NATO to abandon its ideologized Cold War approaches to respect the sovereignty, security, and interests of other countries, the diversities of their civilizational, cultural, and historical backgrounds, and to exercise a fair and objective attitude towards the peaceful development of other states. He also said this: the Russian side reaffirms its support for the One China principle, confirms that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and opposes any forms of independence of Taiwan. So this is a fairly significant thing. So because there's a concern that after the Olympics that China will make a move on Taiwan. I don't know if they're ready to do it militarily, but it's clear that the United States is not in a position to fight a two-front war. The United States is viewed as weak right now with its leadership and its military. We have a military that's become woke. And Russia and China pay attention to these things, and they're not impressed with what the United States is doing with respect to its military. So that may be part of what comes out of this. So this has been sort of the central of everything, and here's another part of the joint statement. The sides oppose the return of international relations to the state of confrontation between major powers when the weak fall prey to the strong. So, they're sort of taking a poor me. Now, the other thing that happened was, of course, Macron, he has to get involved. So he went to Russia and met at Russia with this, this giant table in between and he and Putin, they had about 6 hours of talks. There was a lot of back and forth. Somebody put this up as kind of a representation of the back and forth between Putin and Macron at this meeting in Russia the other day. And here is some part of this.
I see how much effort
this going back and they just listen to this.
Put to solve the crisis tied to providing equal security in Europe in a serious historic perspective, and to solve the issue of Ukraine's internal crisis in the southeast of the country.
I think today's discussion can start to show the direction of where we need to go in a de-escalation, the terms of which we already know.
Une désescalade dont nous connaissons d'ailleurs les termes. Je me réjouis d'avoir l'opportunité de pouvoir.
So they had this meeting, and so then afterwards they did this joint statement, and this is Putin talking at this joint statement. And he said, you realize that if Ukraine joins NATO and decides to take Crimea back through military means, the European countries will automatically get drawn into a military conflict with Russia? Of course, NATO's united potential and that of Russia are incomparable. We understand that, but we also understand that Russia is one of the world's leading nuclear force components. It is superior to many of you, but there will be no winners, and you will find yourself drawn into this conflict against your will. You will be fulfilling paragraph 5 of the Treaty of Rome in a heartbeat, even before you know it. Of course, the President does not want to see developments unfold in this way. I do not want it either. That is why he is here and has been tormenting me for 6 hours now with his questions, guarantees, and solutions. I believe this is a lofty mission, and I am grateful to him for his efforts. For our part, we will do our best to find compromises that suit everyone. There is not a single point that we consider unachievable in the proposals we sent to NATO and Washington, which essentially was break up NATO or no further expansion of NATO and severe restrictions on NATO. So this long table thing has been kind of used. This is an editorial cartoon showing that, here's Boris Johnson on one side, and on the other side, far, far away, is the Tory donor. Macron also went to meet with Zelensky, the head of Ukraine. So again, there was the united stand on Taiwan. Also, this is kind of a side issue, but so what you're seeing though, because the United States is weak, you're seeing other things happen. So, for example, here is a article about North Korea and its development of maneuverable missiles, hypersonic missiles, and this is another concern. So, while all of this going on, North Korea is using the dispute and the inability of the United States to come up with a strong response to Putin. I think it's been pretty weak so far, and I'm not sure that I'm not saying we should go in there, but certainly Putin is evaluating things in the way that's going to benefit him. So let's just look at the Middle East real quickly, and we'll be done with this update. So here was a U.S. general, the new head of CENTCOM in the Middle East. The guy proposed for that, waiting a Senate approval. He had a hearing the other day, and he said, look, Russian turmoil could spill into the Middle East. Here's what he said. Ask about the potential for repercussions in the Middle East of a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. Kurilla said he believes that it could spill over into Syria, where Russia already has a military base and troops. If Russia does invade Ukraine, they would not hesitate to be able to act as a spoiler in Syria as well, said Kurilla. He added that the U.S. doesn't believe Russia wants to go to war with the United States, but he also recognizes what's going on. There's also an interesting article just released Monday at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Title of the article is, "A U.S. failure in the Ukraine crisis could lead to a conflagration in the Middle East and Asia." So this is where this might have some impact on Bible prophecy, that all of the players in the Middle East would view the United States as weak, and they would think that they could come and do this. So here's what it said. It is not clear yet whether the Ukraine crisis will end peacefully or war will erupt on European soil. Nevertheless, several observations are in order. For years, many in the West have celebrated the reduced ability of military force in international relations. Scholars heralded the end of history and the reign of a norm-based international liberal order. Yet whatever progress there was, human nature did not change. As Thucydides aptly pointed out, fear is a basic and powerful instinct. So he goes on. I would highly recommend that you go, rather than me read the article to you. He makes a couple other points. A fearful Russia amassed many troops along the Ukrainian border to draw American attention to its demands. Indeed, that the tacit threat of military invasion got the U.S. to listen to Moscow's security concerns. Russia wants to be treated like the Soviet Union, so it wants a voice in the European security structure. Everybody, friends and foes of America, watch Washington and see a feeble administration. The crisis confirms the observed trend of America's decline in global affairs. Perceptions dictate behavior. For Europe, the crisis is an eye-opener. Despite talking about a European army and strategic autonomy, Europe still needs an American security umbrella to face a more assertive Russia, also a major energy supplier. Ukrainians probably realize that we still live in a Hobbesian world where every state is on its own, and life is often solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So this is a significant thing. Now, one thing that also happened a couple of weeks ago in Israel was that there was a joint Russian-Syrian air patrol along the Golan Heights, along the border between Israel and Syria. They didn't cross into Israeli territory. So the question is, what does this mean? Here's some film that one of the news agencies put up about this. There were some Syrian fighters and Russian fighters that patrolled along the border. And people are saying, so is this a show of force? Was this a message to Israel? Alma Research, who I think is pretty good, that they put up a report and they said, we're not sure that this was a message to Israel. but it was a projection of power to influence the people that are involved in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Another article in the Jerusalem Post is are they trying to provoke Israel against Russian assets in Syria by doing these things? And Iran is putting things close to Russian assets so that when Israel attacks them, and there was an attack just yesterday on Syria, and Russia, in response to that, issued demands that Israel stop its airstrikes in Syria. So I think this does have an impact on the Middle East. I think it does have potentially prophetic significance given the way the power is shifting, and that even mainstream publications like the Wall Street Journal say this is an Iran, Russia, China alliance that's developing, and we see a lot of things about that. So that's my update on Ukraine. Sunday we're going to talk about. I'm not going to do another update. I'll do it on Sunday. We'll talk about this Amnesty International report, essentially calling everything that Israel does apartheid and calling for the dismantlement of the Jewish state of Israel. This is filled with anti-Semitic tropes, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Again, camera.org has a great article analyzing this. Melanie Phillips has written a great article. We'll talk about those. We'll also talk a little bit about this strategic survey that was released recently by the Institute for National Security Studies. They also had a conference about it titled A Time for Critical Decisions, and we'll look at that on Sunday as well. That it's taken a little while to go through the report because it's in Hebrew. They haven't released the English one yet. Iran has also released a new missile, and this is a editorial cartoon in one of the Arab papers about how Iran negotiates. They get close to an agreement, and everybody else is using a pen, but Iran is negotiating with a missile. And also the attack, this is a recent attack that took place from the Houthis by drone on a hotel in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And this is, in part, I think it's an escalation, and it's also Iran negotiating a better deal for themselves at the Vienna talks, or getting everybody to walk away with no deal, which they would like to. And then we'll also talk about the negotiations that are going on right now with regard to the maritime border dispute between Lebanon and Israel. So that's what we'll talk about on Sunday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you Sunday.